Hey everyone. Tonight we're drifting back to the Middle Ages, where life for most people was, let's say, simple. Simple in the way that boiled cabbage is simple. So if you're lying in bed right now, waiting for your eyelids to get heavy, let's settle in together and take a calm little walk through the daily existence of a medieval peasant. Nothing glamorous, nothing dramatic, just survival, repeated over centuries. Let's start with your home. You live in what's generously called a cottage, but really it's a mud and stick box with a thatched roof. The walls are made of wattle and daub, which sounds quaint until you realize it means twigs plastered with mud, manure, and straw. It smells exactly like you're imagining, and yet it's home. Inside, the floor is dirt, not dirt with a rug over it, just dirt, sometimes swept, sometimes not. And yes, every time it rains, the floor politely turns back into mud. Your bed is a sack of straw. Straw, if you're lucky. Reeds or dried leaves if you're not. The straw isn't fresh. It's been there a while, flattened by use, and inhabited by a thriving community of lice and fleas. But after a day in the fields, honestly, you don't care. You collapse onto it anyway because medieval exhaustion always wins over medieval discomfort. You don't sleep alone. Privacy is a modern luxury. Your spouse, children, and possibly a couple of relatives share the same bed space. If you have animals, and you probably do, some of them sleep inside as well. The family cow or a few chickens might spend the night by the fire, partly for warmth, partly for security. Congratulations, you've just invented the medieval version of a family dog. Morning comes when the sun rises, or when the rooster decides to announce it. You wake stiff and itchy, your joints sore, your eyes gummy. There's no alarm to snooze, and certainly no coffee to coax you out of bed. You rise because there's work waiting, and if you don't do it, no one will. Breakfast is modest, a hunk of coarse bread, maybe dipped in a little ale, because ale is safer to drink than water. Water is full of things you don't want to meet. Ale, weak as it is, kills some of those things. If you're lucky, you add a smear of cheese or a bit of onion. Occasionally, you get porridge. You are not dining like a king. You are barely dining like a pigeon. But it's fuel, and that's enough. And then, work. That's the main occupation of your existence. Work, work, and more work. If it's spring, you're plowing or sowing. In summer, you're weeding or harvesting hay. Autumn is the great harvest. Long days cutting and gathering crops by hand. Winter doesn't let up. You mend fences, patch roofs, feed animals, chop firewood. It's endless. The saying might as well be, a peasant's work is never done, because if it were, they would probably be dead. The land isn't even yours. That's the key. You're tied to a lord, working his fields in exchange for protection, though protection usually means he won't personally burn your hut down. You owe him rents, in labor, in crops, sometimes even in animals. You live at the edge of subsistence. A bad harvest, a sick cow, or just too much rain can mean hunger. And if things get very bad, famine. But there are bright spots, small ones. Work is often communal. Villagers labor together, sharing tools, gossip, and the occasional joke at someone's expense. It makes the monotony easier. And then there are feast days. The church calendar is generous with saints, and each saint provides an excuse for a day off. Not that it's always restful. You might still have to cook, brew, or mend. But there's dancing, singing, and ale. A brief moment to remember that you're human. Speaking of the church, let's drift there for a moment. Religion is woven into every hour of your life. Bells mark time. Prayers mark meals. Holy days mark the seasons. You are reminded constantly that this hard, muddy, back-breaking existence is temporary, and that a better, eternal life awaits. Assuming, of course, you behave, and behaving means obedience to God, to priests, to lords. You might not understand every sermon, since they're in Latin, but the imagery is clear enough. Hell is hot. Heaven is not. That's all you really need to know. Clothing is wool. Always wool. A tunic if you're a man. A long dress if you're a woman. Hose if you can afford them, which you probably can't. Shoes if you're very lucky. Otherwise, it's bare feet in all seasons. In winter, you shiver. In summer, you sweat. And always, you smell. Not just you, everyone. Baths are rare. Soap exists, but not in abundance. And since everyone around you is equally fragrant, it stops being noticeable. It's just the background scent of medieval life. At midday, you pause for your second meal. More bread, perhaps a stew, called pottage, made from barley or oats with whatever vegetables you've grown. Leeks, beans, peas, cabbage. Meat is rare. When you do get it, usually pork, it's a luxury. Chickens are more valuable alive for eggs. Beef belongs to the rich. Hunting is forbidden unless you want to risk your lord's wrath. And no, you don't. So you eat mostly plants. A medieval dietitian would call it balanced. You would call it boring. The afternoon brings more work. You trudge back to the fields, the sun crawling across the sky as slowly as your own body. Time isn't measured by clocks but by the sun and the church bell. And eventually, blessedly, the day winds down. Evening means one last meal, often leftovers from earlier. You sit around the fire with your family. The fire is your light, your warmth, your hearth, and your entertainment. Stories are told. Songs are sung. Maybe someone has a riddle. Maybe a neighbor stops by with gossip about who stole whose chicken. Entertainment doesn't need to be elaborate. It just needs to pass the time before sleep reclaims you. And sleep does reclaim you. Candles are precious, so once the fire dies low, darkness rules. You crawl back onto your straw sack, pull a rough wool blanket over yourself, and drift off, sore and tired, but alive. Tomorrow will be the same. The day after, the same again. And so it goes, year after year, generation after generation. It sounds monotonous, and it is. But there's also a strange stability to it. Peasants knew their place in the world, their tasks, their roles, their boundaries. Kings might rise and fall. Wars might rage in distant lands. But here, on this patch of earth, life continued in its muddy, itchy, exhausting way. And sometimes, that very sameness was its own kind of comfort. So as you lie there in your own bed, clean sheets, central heating, maybe even a pillow or two, you can let your mind wander back to that medieval cottage. Picture the thatched roof above, the smell of smoke and damp straw, the faint warmth of the fire. Hear the quiet crackle, the distant sound of animals shifting in their stalls, and let yourself drift, because for the medieval peasant, sleep was not an escape. It was simply the pause between one day of labor and the next. But for you, tonight, it can be something more restful. So, now that we've had our quiet little walk through the life of the medieval peasant, let's climb a little higher. Higher into the world of royalty, into castles and courts and endless tapestries. You might imagine the higher you climb, the easier life becomes. But in Europe's royal families, it often became stranger and much less healthy. Because, of course, the biggest obsession for monarchs was bloodlines, not metaphorical bloodlines, the actual, literal family tree. The idea was simple: keep the power in the family, marry your cousin, your niece, sometimes even your aunt, if it meant keeping the throne safe from outsiders. For them, it was politics. For us, it was genetics. And the results were not flattering. Let's start with the Habsburgs. You can't talk about inbreeding without them. They were the poster family for, maybe we've taken this cousin thing too far. At one point, their family tree looked less like a branching structure and more like a wreath, circles within circles, looping back on itself. By the 1500s, the Habsburgs controlled vast chunks of Europe, from Austria to Spain to the Holy Roman Empire. And they did it by keeping marriages strictly in-house. One of the most famous outcomes of this practice was the so-called Habsburg jaw, a protruding lower jaw so prominent it could have had its own title. Portraits of Habsburg rulers showed chins jutting forward with stubborn determination, lips unable to close properly. It wasn't just cosmetic. It caused speech problems, chewing difficulties, and, ironically, made them look less royal and more like perpetually puzzled turnips. Take Charles II of Spain, sometimes nicknamed El Hechizado, the Bewitched. Born in 1661, Charles was the tragic, almost comical result of 200 years of cousin marriages. His family tree showed more repeats than a medieval church hymn. His parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were also uncle and niece. By the time Charles came along, his genetic diversity was about as robust as a puddle. Charles himself was frail, sickly, and developmentally delayed. He didn't learn to speak until he was 4, didn't walk until he was 8. His tongue was so large it interfered with his ability to chew, talk, or swallow. His jaw jutted so far that eating was a daily challenge. And yet, he was king, because in this system, it didn't matter if you could rule. It mattered that your last name was spelled correctly. Naturally, he never produced an heir. He was married twice, but the unions produced no children, which was not surprising considering his health problems and the fact that his body was fighting against itself most of the time. When he died in 1700 at just 38 years old, he was the last of the Spanish Habsburg line. His death sparked the War of the Spanish Succession, because apparently, the only thing Europe liked more than cousin marriages was fighting wars about who was related to whom. But Charles wasn't alone. The entire Habsburg dynasty suffered similar fates, though not always quite so severe. Generations of cousin marriages meant short lives, strange jawlines, and an impressive collection of medical problems. And still, they carried on with it. Because, of course, the alternative, marrying an outsider, was unthinkable. Now, let's drift over to the Bourbons of France. You'd think they would have learned from watching their neighbors. But no, the Bourbons married into their own branches as well, ensuring their dynastic claim stayed pure. The irony here is that the obsession with purity often made the bloodlines weaker, not stronger. Many Bourbon children died in infancy. Those who survived often did so with chronic illnesses. Still, the French court continued to arrange marriages like they were drawing names from a very limited hat. The British royals were not immune either. The Hanoverians, who eventually gave rise to the Windsors, dabbled in the cousin marriage trend. Queen Victoria famously carried the gene for hemophilia, which she generously passed along to several European dynasties, including the Romanovs of Russia. Victoria's children married across Europe, scattering the disease like confetti at a wedding reception. By the early 20th century, hemophilia was sometimes called the royal disease because of how often it appeared in noble houses. Speaking of the Romanovs, let's pause there. Tsarevich Alexei, son of Nicholas II and heir to the Russian throne, was perhaps the most famous victim of hemophilia. A minor bump or bruise could lead to life-threatening internal bleeding. His parents, desperate, turned to the mystical healer Rasputin, whose influence at court became legendary and eventually disastrous. All of this traced back to the dynastic marriages arranged by Queen Victoria's descendants. A small genetic quirk, amplified by inbreeding, altered the course of Russian history. It's a recurring theme. Royals who thought they were strengthening their houses by marrying cousins were often weakening them instead. Sometimes physically, sometimes politically, sometimes both. But did that stop them? Of course not. Let's return just briefly to the Habsburgs one more time, because one detail about Charles II is worth lingering on. When doctors performed an autopsy after his death, they noted that his body was so full of water, his intestines putrefied, his chest deformed, and his head full of water. His heart was small, his lungs corroded. He was, in short, a walking testament to centuries of genetic recycling. Yet, while peasants struggled in the mud, kings like Charles lived surrounded by gold, jewels, and elaborate ceremonies. Proof, perhaps, that wealth does not always buy health. So, as you lie in bed, you can drift between two images: the peasant in his drafty hut, tired but sturdy, and the king in his lavish palace, frail and unsteady, undone not by war or poverty, but by his own family tree looping in circles. And maybe, just maybe, it's a reminder that sometimes it's better to marry outside the family, or at least to marry someone whose jaw doesn't look suspiciously familiar. So let's begin with the basics. A royal marriage was rarely about romance. Instead, it was an early form of international contract law, sealed with rings and awkward banquets. Marrying someone from another kingdom could secure alliances, gain land, or at least stop a war for a few decades. Unfortunately, the same habit of cousin marrying we saw in the Habsburgs also crept into these political unions, and the results were not flattering. Take, for instance, Philip II of Spain. He was one of the most powerful men in the 16th century, ruler of a sprawling empire that stretched across continents. He also married 4 times, in a series of unions that seemed cursed from the start. His first wife was Maria Manuela of Portugal, who was both his cousin and his double cousin. She died giving birth at just 17, the baby surviving only a few hours. His second marriage, to Mary I of England, yes, Bloody Mary, was cold and politically motivated. Mary was desperate for a Catholic heir. Philip was desperate for control over England. They got neither. She died childless, miserable, and heartbroken. Philip's third wife, Elizabeth of Valois, at least brought some warmth. She was French, vivacious, and by all accounts, a bright light in the otherwise dour Spanish court. Naturally, she too died young, leaving behind 2 daughters but no male heir. Finally, his fourth marriage was to Anna of Austria, his niece. Yes, his literal niece. That union did at least produce a son. But the poor boy inherited all the unfortunate Habsburg traits we've already talked about. That son was Charles II, the bewitched king, the one with the jaw, the developmental delays, and the tragic body catalogued at autopsy. In other words, the Habsburgs doubled down on their genetic roulette, and the result was predictably grim. But Philip wasn't the only royal with unlucky marriage stories. Let's drift over to France for a moment. Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette are usually remembered for their guillotines, not their romance. Their marriage, arranged when they were teenagers, was more about cementing the bond between France and Austria than about personal happiness. Louis was shy, awkward, and possibly suffering from a mild medical condition that made consummating the marriage a challenge. For 7 years, the marriage was unconsummated. 7 years of political pressure, gossip, and awkward silences at court dinners. Eventually, after some medical advice and possibly minor surgery, the issue was resolved, and children followed. But by then, the marriage had already become a public joke. Pamphlets circulated mocking the queen's supposed promiscuity, while her husband was painted as weak and incompetent. Ironically, while the peasants were starving, Parisian gossip mills obsessed over the royal bedroom. And of course, we know how it ended, with both their heads separated from their shoulders, which is about as final as marriage difficulties can get. Now, to England. Henry VIII deserves his own sleepy monologue. His marital career alone could keep us awake, or lull us to sleep for hours. 6 wives, 2 annulments, 2 executions, 1 death in childbirth, 1 divorce, and 1 survivor. The royal equivalent of a disastrous dating profile, but the underlying theme was the same as in other courts: desperate obsession with producing a male heir, and endless manipulation of marriage as a political tool. His first wife, Catherine of Aragon, was actually married to Henry's older brother, Arthur, before Arthur died young. The Pope had to grant a special dispensation for Catherine to marry Henry, since technically she was his sister-in-law. This set the tone for a lifetime of bending religious rules to suit marital needs. The irony? His much-coveted son, Edward VI, died at 15. The Tudor dynasty, which Henry tore England apart to secure, fizzled in less than a generation. His surviving heirs were 2 daughters, Mary and Elizabeth, each ruling in their own dramatic style. So all the divorces, executions, and broken alliances produced very little lasting legacy, except perhaps the phrase, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. A bedtime rhyme, if you like, though perhaps not one you'd use for children. Meanwhile, over in Russia, the Romanovs were busy with their own troubled unions. Marriages in the Russian court were often arranged with a focus on alliances with German princely houses. This led to a steady trickle of German brides into the Russian throne. Catherine the Great herself was a German princess, married off to the unfortunate Peter III. Their marriage was miserable. Peter was immature, eccentric, and more interested in toy soldiers than in ruling an empire or in his wife. Catherine, ambitious and intelligent, quickly realized her marriage was doomed. She took lovers, built her own networks of power, and eventually overthrew Peter in a coup. He died mysteriously soon after, officially of natural causes, though suspiciously close to Catherine's rise to power. Their unhappy union may not have been genetically disastrous, but politically it was a complete failure, ending with a murder and a rebranding campaign that still carries Catherine's name centuries later. And then there was poor George IV of England, known as the Prince Regent during his father's mental decline. George had a marriage that began with disaster and never really improved. He was secretly married, illegally, to a Catholic widow, Maria Fitzherbert, before being forced into an official marriage with Caroline of Brunswick. When he first met Caroline, he was so repulsed that he asked for brandy. Their wedding night ended with him drunk and passed out on the floor. They produced one child, Princess Charlotte, but the marriage was effectively over before it began. Caroline lived largely abroad. George pursued mistresses, and the two engaged in decades of public feuding. By the time George became king, their marriage was a national embarrassment, filled with gossip, trials, and bitter exchanges. Across Europe, the pattern repeats. Royals marry for politics, not affection. The results are sickly children, dynastic crises, or sometimes just decades of mutual loathing. And yet, they kept at it, because the idea of marrying for love was considered reckless, even dangerous. Better to marry a cousin and keep the throne safe than to risk scandal with someone unsuitable. And so, as you lie back in your bed, you can let these images drift together. The peasants, snoring in their straw. The inbred Habsburgs, staring blankly into the middle distance with jaws that could hardly close. And the royals, trapped in palaces with spouses they despised, pressured by courts that cared more about heirs than happiness. It's all a reminder, really. History may look glamorous in portraits and marble statues, but up close, it was filled with awkward dinners, medical oddities, and marriages that could best be described as genetically unwise. Royal power was vast, but royal tempers were fragile. Many monarchs treated their kingdoms like giant, glittering dollhouses, to be rearranged whenever they grew bored or offended. And, of course, their subjects paid the price for these whims. Let's start softly with King Louis XIV of France, the so-called Sun King. He was majestic, radiant, and liked to be compared to Apollo, the god of the sun, which is already a bit much. Louis turned Versailles into the center of his universe, insisting that courtiers revolve around him like planets. But his pettiness wasn't just metaphorical. He controlled every detail of life at court. Who got to hand him his gloves, who stood closest to his chair, even who had the honor of watching him brush his teeth. Imagine being so powerful that you could turn basic hygiene into a prestige ceremony. Louis' obsession with control meant that minor slights became major insults. If a nobleman failed to bow deeply enough or tried to wear the wrong colored coat, Louis would notice, and he would remember. Entire careers at court collapsed because someone accidentally wore the wrong shade of blue on the wrong Tuesday. Versailles, beneath all its chandeliers and fountains, was essentially the world's most glamorous middle school cafeteria, ruled by a monarch who acted as both principal and head mean girl. But Louis was far from alone in his flair for dysfunction. King James VI of Scotland and I of England, the man who gave us the King James Bible, was brilliant, scholarly, and constantly paranoid about witches. He was convinced they were out to get him personally, especially after a storm disrupted his voyage to fetch his bride, Anne of Denmark. Clearly, he reasoned, witches had stirred the winds against him. He even wrote a book called Demonology, basically a royal guidebook on spotting witches. Under his reign, witch trials and burnings spiked. Thousands of lives upended because James couldn't handle a rough patch of weather without blaming supernatural women. Let's drift over to Empress Wu Zetian of China, the only woman to ever officially rule as emperor. She was clever, ruthless, and very good at surviving palace intrigue. But she also had a fondness for settling scores. Rivals were eliminated not just with executions, but with creative humiliations. Officials who displeased her sometimes had their families demoted, their names struck from records, or their ancestors publicly insulted. Wu understood the art of cutting not just your enemy, but their legacy. The pettiness was so thorough it extended beyond death. Back in Europe, King Charles VI of France was nicknamed Charles the Mad, and not without reason. His reign was filled with unpredictable breakdowns. At one point, he believed he was made of glass. Yes, actual glass. He wore reinforced clothing and refused to let people touch him in case he shattered. His courtiers had to tiptoe around both his ego and his delusions, creating a bizarre and fragile court atmosphere. Imagine ruling a war-torn medieval kingdom while convinced you might break like a wine glass at any moment. It didn't inspire confidence. Then there was Queen Christina of Sweden, brilliant, eccentric, and thoroughly uninterested in the expectations of her time. She hated traditional court life, refused to marry, and eventually abdicated the throne altogether. But before she left, she indulged in acts of striking dysfunction. She once ordered the execution of her best friend and rumored lover, simply because the woman annoyed her. At court banquets, she would make cutting remarks so sharp they ruined reputations in an instant. Christina was the sort of monarch who treated power like a theater stage, her own personality the main performance. And we cannot forget Peter the Great of Russia. He modernized his empire, built a navy, and dragged Russia closer to Europe's orbit. But he also had a famously petty streak. Peter hated long beards, which he associated with backwardness. So he issued a beard tax. Men had to either shave or pay a fee to keep their facial hair, and those who resisted sometimes had their beards personally hacked off by the Tsar. Imagine having the ruler of a vast empire stalk over with scissors, determined to reshape your chin hair in the name of progress. Petty, yes. Effective, somewhat. Traumatizing? Definitely. Now, George III of Britain is remembered mostly for his mental illness, but even before his decline, he had a controlling, fussy nature. He micromanaged his family's marriages, insisting his sons could not wed without his permission. This led to scandal after scandal, with secret marriages, illegitimate children, and endless arguments. George wanted order. His children wanted freedom. The result was dysfunction on a dynastic scale, with future kings starting their reigns already saddled with messy personal reputations. Let's also mention King Ferdinand VII of Spain, sometimes called the worst king Spain ever had, which is impressive given the competition. Ferdinand was petulant, indecisive, and vengeful. He reversed reforms, imprisoned rivals, and changed alliances based on personal mood swings. His reign was like a long, drawn-out tantrum with national consequences. Spain entered a steep decline under his rule, but Ferdinand himself seemed more interested in punishing enemies and clinging to his throne than in actually governing. And then there's Queen Isabella II of Spain, his daughter, who continued the tradition of dysfunction. Her reign was marred by rumors about her personal life, including affairs with both men and women, and an arranged marriage so unhappy that both spouses openly sought comfort elsewhere. Politically weak and personally careless, she turned her court into a spectacle of gossip and scandal. Eventually, she was deposed, which was probably the only way to stop the drama from spreading further. What unites all these rulers isn't just their power, but their astonishing ability to let personal quirks shape entire nations. Whether it was Louis XIV fretting about etiquette, James I blaming witches for storms, or Peter the Great waging war on beards, their private fixations became public policy. Whole populations were taxed, persecuted, or humiliated because their monarch had a fragile ego or an eccentric obsession. And as you drift deeper into sleep, you can picture them all together. The glass king tiptoeing in reinforced clothes, the beardless Russian courtiers trying to avoid scissors, the nobles at Versailles anxiously checking their coat colors, and the witch hunting James glaring at the sky, convinced the clouds were conspiring against him. It's almost comforting, really. For all their jewels and crowns, they were still deeply human, fragile, insecure, and astonishingly petty, just like the rest of us, only with far more chandeliers. The Bourbon dynasty liked to imagine itself as a kind of celestial family, hand-picked by God, destined for grandeur distinct from the bickering cousins around them. In reality, they were just as prone to inbreeding, tantrums, and disastrous personal lives as anyone else in Europe. They were, in short, human, though they worked very hard to pretend otherwise. Let's start with Henry IV of France, founder of the Bourbon line on the French throne. Nicknamed Good King Henry, he was popular, affable, and constantly entangled in affairs. He switched religions more than once, famously remarking that Paris is well worth a mass when converting to Catholicism to secure his crown. Pragmatic? Yes. Holy conviction? Not so much. His private life was a revolving door of mistresses, illegitimate children, and a queen, Marie de Medici, who was thoroughly unimpressed by her husband's extracurricular activities. Henry's charisma made him beloved, but his bloodline was already being complicated by his inability to keep his affections in one place. Henry's son, Louis XIII, was less charming. Remember him? The shy, stammering boy we met earlier. He grew into a king who was perpetually anxious, deeply devout, and largely under the shadow of Cardinal Richelieu. His marriage to Anne of Austria was a disaster for decades. They barely spoke, lived separately, and had no children for 20 years. This naturally caused whispers about Louis's preferences, his health, and his competence as a king. Eventually, they did produce an heir, but not before half of Europe speculated about whether divine providence or simple marital estrangement was to blame. And then came the jewel of the Bourbons, Louis XIV, the Sun King. Here was a man who took self-branding to levels even modern influencers might envy. He bathed his monarchy in light, literally and figuratively, staging himself as the center of the universe. Versailles became a palace of mirrors, fountains, and endless protocol designed to keep the nobility busy bowing instead of plotting. It was brilliant political theater, but beneath the grandeur, Louis's personal life was a web of mistresses, illegitimate children, and awkward family dramas. He married once for politics, and later for love, secretly remarrying to Madame de Maintenon, a widow and governess, which was a scandalous downgrade in rank. The Sun King projected absolute control, but his family tree showed the same old Bourbon mess. Louis XIV's children, legitimate and otherwise, added to the confusion. Some died young, others schemed endlessly, and the whole line seemed cursed with early deaths that left the dynasty fragile. By the time his successor, Louis XV, inherited the throne at the age of 5, the Bourbon claim to being different was looking thin. Louis XV began well, hailed as the well-beloved, but childhood spoiling, remember, rarely ends well. He grew into a king whose reign was dominated by indifference, distraction, and a notorious appetite for mistresses. The Parc aux Cerfs, his private residence for young lovers, became infamous across Europe. It wasn't just indecent, it was also politically disastrous. As courtiers and the public saw the king sinking into decadence while the kingdom's finances collapsed, France stumbled toward revolution, while the king distracted himself with silk and satin. Spoiled child became spoiled monarch, and the pattern repeated itself. And then we arrive at Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, a royal couple often remembered as the face of decadence, though the truth was more awkward than scandalous. Louis XVI was shy, indecisive, and mechanically minded. He preferred locks, keys, and tinkering with metalwork to ruling. Marie Antoinette, meanwhile, was a teenager thrust into the most scrutinized role in Europe, unprepared and immature. Their marriage was famously unconsummated for years, which became the talk of Europe. Pamphlets mocked them, courtiers gossiped, and eventually, medical intervention and perhaps just time resolved the issue. But the damage was done. The monarchy looked ridiculous. Louis and Marie weren't evil masterminds of decadence, as revolutionary propaganda later painted them. They were, rather, two ill-prepared young people in over their heads. But their Bourbon arrogance, the assumption that divine right would protect them, blinded them to the growing anger of their subjects. When the revolution came, the illusion of Bourbon difference shattered on the guillotine. Even after the revolution, the Bourbons refused to learn. Restored to the throne in the 19th century, they carried on much as before, clinging to divine right, pretending the world hadn't changed, and acting bewildered when their subjects disagreed. The arrogance of difference remained, right up until history swept them away for good. What makes the Bourbons particularly fascinating isn't just their downfall, but the way they insisted on their exceptionalism while clearly sharing the same flaws as every other dynasty. They married cousins, spoiled their heirs, indulged in affairs, ignored their subjects, and believed their crowns were invincible. Spoiler, they weren't. As you drift deeper into rest, imagine Versailles at night. The fountains silent, the halls empty, the mirrors reflecting only candlelight. All the ritual, all the grandeur, all the performances of difference, fading into quiet. The Bourbons weren't different. They were human, fragile, flawed, and, like so many dynasties, undone by the same weaknesses they pretended not to have.